Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Schreffler, Associate Dean for the Arts in the College of Arts and Letters here at Notre Dame, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural edition of Ahead of the Game, a football season series sponsored by the college. Over the course of the season, we'll be hearing from a number of faculty members from all over the college, and they'll make presentations on their research in an accessible and engaging way. We're delighted to have you here today, and we hope to see you again next week when my colleague Sophie White will discuss material from her recent award-winning book on slavery in French Louisiana. But before I introduce our speaker for today, I would like to thank some of the people involved in putting this event together. I'd like to thank our colleagues in the Department of Music and the program in Sacred Music, especially. We're in their building. I'd like to acknowledge Peter Jeffrey, Margot Fassler, Janet Rudasix, Matt Haynes, and Daniel Stein, who all worked on the program. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Chloe Leach, Senior Administrative Coordinator in the College of Arts and Letters, who is with us here today. Chloe worked with our speakers and the communications office and with many others to make the series happen. So thank you, Chloe. And now to introduce our speaker, Kathleen Sprows Cummings. Professor Cummings is Professor of American Studies and History at Notre Dame, where she also directs the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. Her most recent book is A Saint of Our Own, the story of how Catholics in the US pursued the canonization of the first American saints, among them Elizabeth Ann Seton. Professor Cummings teaches classes on the history of Catholicism and on American religion more broadly, and she often serves as a media commentator on contemporary events in the church. Her lecture today focuses on the history of Notre Dame before it was either a football powerhouse or a top-tier research university. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Sprows Cummings.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. I want to echo your thanks to Chloe, to all the tech people, to our hosts in this building. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and thanks to all of you for being here. I do want to be clear, as I tried to signal in my short description, that this lecture is about before Notre Dame became a football powerhouse. In that sense, the new title of this series, Ahead of the Game, is perfect for me, that we are going to be talking about before football. Just to give you a little glimpse of what I'm talking about, this is a snapshot from the Scholastic in 1887. As we'll see, the 1880s were a tremendously important decade for Notre Dame in defining itself as an American institution. And here was what they had to say about football. We have a ragtag bunch of people playing, and this was when Michigan came, the champions of the West, and they had to instruct the Notre Dame players as to how to play, and in fact, they all switched sides. They were just trying to get the game over with. So this is a little bit, it's very different than it is today, so I want to just be upfront about that. That said, football is obviously a part of the story. Much of what I'm talking about today is drawn from a course I've just started teaching here called Notre Dame America. And I have to say the same thing to my students on the first day, that it is not a course about football, that we will certainly talk about Newt Rockne and the forward pass and the Fighting Irish in the 1920s, but that's not where we start. That said, this is a quote from a New York Times article that was published ahead of the Shamrock series in 2018. And I really love it because it captures what I'm trying to convey as a historian of Catholicism, that Notre Dame from the beginning was a national institution, because it recruited, its community was defined by a religious faith, not by geography. And you can see that right away from the outset with Father Sorin. And of course, that would come into play in the 20th century, particularly in the 1920s and beyond, with football. But what I'm talking about and giving just a few glimpses of Notre Dame's history from the 1830s into the 1930s is about that religious faith. And that, in turn, explains my title. Poor Chloe, I had to verify with her like a million times that my title was God, Notre Dame, Country, and that because our ears around here say it the other way, God, Country, Notre Dame. That is what is inscribed on the East Basilica doors, the Notre Dame War Memorial. That you can see was established in 1924. Statues of St. Joan of Arc and St. Michael were added in 1944 in the middle of World War II. That's the title of Father Ted's autobiography, God, Country, Notre Dame. But my approach, really starting in the beginning, it's more accurate to talk about God, Notre Dame, Country. And I'm going to foreground Notre Dame, our mother, devotion to the Blessed Mother, and talk about how that was a really important part, not just of the founding years, but far beyond them. And so in that sense, I want to foreground an image that's inside the basilica, a mural painted by Luigi Gregori, who Father Sorin engaged, a former artist in the papal household of Pius IX, engaged him to come and paint the basilica. He's become much more renowned, well, infamous, I should say, for painting the Columbus Murals in the main building, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But he was brought here to paint the basilica, and this is a beautiful image. So long before Notre Dame's iconic grotto was erected, this was painted in the basilica, an image of Our Lady of Lourdes appearing to Saint Bernadette, and in the apparition saying the words, I am the Immaculate Conception. So we'll talk about that as well. Now, it's not that the country is not important. Obviously it was. The fact that Father Sorin and the other founders founded it in the United States. It enters into the story in things like the reason we have our own zip code. In 1850, Father Sorin invoked the intercession of the Virgin Mary to try to get a post office at Notre Dame. He failed in that attempt, but a year later was given a post office. And these are some images. You can see it. It's the white building on the right there. Did Father Sorin do it for patriotic reasons? Well, not especially. I mean, it was probably a matter of convenience in getting a federal post office established here. It meant that the federal government had to clear the roads at least 3 times a week so the stagecoach could come and deliver the mail. So it was a practical thing. Father Sorin became a citizen of the United States. Very important, but again, he wasn't an American patriot or anything like that. And so I'd like to talk about him, present him very much as a missionary. Sometimes we refer to him as an immigrant, so a person who came from another country, France, to the United States, which of course is true. But because he was traveling as a member of a religious community, he was a missionary. The United States was classified as mission territory by the Vatican until 1908. So for the entirety of Father Sorin's life, so anyone member of a religious community who traveled to this country on that time was not simply traveling between 2 countries, Ireland to the United States and France to the United States, but I think of it more as a triangle. You have France, the United States, and you have Rome, the Holy See, the Papal States, for most of this time. So I want to foreground that, although, as I said, the United States is obviously important, but it is the last on the list, and hence my argument, God, Notre Dame, Country. This is a wonderful image of Father Sorin and the journey of 6 Holy Cross brothers coming, first sailing across the ocean, landing in New York, and making their way overland, first to Vincennes. And I think a lot of people know that he didn't come to the South Bend area first. And I want to spend a little bit of time, speaking of Rome, I want to look what the view from Rome was of the United States and what Father Sorin was coming to. He was not coming to the state of Indiana. He was coming to the Diocese of Vincennes. This is a wonderful map from the Catholic Almanac of 1845, which shows 21 dioceses. Admittedly, you can't see it very well. But you can see that the diocesan boundaries, the way the Catholic Church organizes itself, are much more visible than the state boundaries. So we see Indiana in very small letters, but we see Vincennes in large letters. He was missioned to the Diocese of Vincennes, and that is where he went. You can even see St. Louis, a vast archdiocese, much different than just the city of St. Louis. This was a time of great expansion for the church. Just for a little context, today there are about 20-odd dioceses in the United States. Dioceses, that's a hard word. There are 200 odd dioceses in the United States. But it was a vast change from 1790, when the first U.S. diocese was erected, contiguous with the entire United States at that time, the Diocese of Baltimore. At this time, it's just an amazing visual, I think. There were about 30 priests ministering in the United States, 30 Catholic priests in this vast territory. And that's why I think it's so significant for our history that when Bishop John Carroll ordained Father Stephen Baden as the first priest ordained in the United States in 1793, I think of how wonderful that must have been for him to kind of add to the people who could serve U.S. Catholics. Of course, Father Baden is remembered here. I'm not going to talk about him a lot today, but a French missionary who was ordained in 1793 and made his way to this area where he ministered among the Potawatomi, many of whom had converted to Catholicism as a result of Jesuit missionaries. This is not the last time Jesuits will enter our story today, and as you probably know, there's often a little bit of competition between Notre Dame and the Jesuits, so Notre Dame will come out on top. When Father Baden went back to the Kentucky area, he was quite an itinerant. One of the missionaries who succeeded him was Benjamin Petit, who was a brilliant young lawyer from France who arrived in Indiana in 1837 as a French missionary priest, and he picked up the language of the local Potawatomi almost immediately, within a few weeks. He was very gifted, and they loved him. They loved him so much, and he loved them, that he accompanied them on one of the tragic aspects of the story of Native Americans, the removal of Potawatomi from this area, the Potawatomi Trail of Tears. So just an area south of here, Twin Lakes. This shows the journey in 1938, in which most of the Potawatomi, not all, some members of the Pokagon band who were Catholic, had converted to Catholicism, were permitted to stay, and French missionaries played a part in negotiating that permission. But Father Petit accompanied them and fell ill himself on the journey, and was returning to this area when he died in St. Louis in February of 1989. I mention him because Father Soren later went to St. Louis and retrieved his body, and he's buried in the log chapel along with Father Baden. There are 4 French missionaries buried in the log chapel, and he was kind of a hero to Father Soren, as we'll see. But again, this is just a little bit of what things looked like before Notre Dame du Lac, before Father Soren and the brothers were told by the Bishop of Vincennes that it would perhaps be better for them to go up to the northern reaches of the diocese. They had started near the city of Vincennes, go almost as far as they could. The boundary between the Diocese of Detroit is just north of where we are today. And so that is in fact what they did in November of 1842. I want to talk now about Notre Dame's founding story, and that is a story that we celebrate, and justly so. It's a fabulous founding story, as founding stories go. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the founder's plaque, which is right by the replica of the log chapel, just overlooking the lakes. This contains an excerpt from a letter written from Father Soren to his superior in France, Basil Moreau, on December 5th, 1842, and we quote it an awful lot around here, as we should. I won't read all of this, but he's looking out over a frozen landscape, and he envisions a college that will one day thrive and be one of the most powerful means of doing good in this country. A phrase we do quote a lot, and Notre Dame is a force for good. This is excerpted and placed on the letter. Now, as you know, we've been talking a lot as a nation about monuments, and there are a lot of controversies over public monuments and what gets remembered. And this is a meme that I just discussed with my students this week. It was published a year ago, and like any good meme, it really conveys some complex truths in a very kind of funny way. And you know, basically what this means is that when we have conversations about public history, about public monuments, the story is more complex, and historians like me and students in my classes have to spend an awful lot of time plowing through occasionally very boring and sometimes very exciting documents to try to contextualize them. So I want to apply that now to our wonderful founder's plaque and talk about the original source from which this letter was excerpted, which I should say, in full disclosure, I haven't actually seen myself. The original source is in French, and it's in Le Mans, France. So I've seen a translation of the letter, so I'm even removed from it that way. But what's fascinating is that right after Father Sorin has this wonderful vision, he writes to Basil Moreau. I won't read the whole thing, and you won't have time to read the whole thing, but he basically says, yes, I have this great vision, but I don't actually want to do it. And my dear Father, if I could be reassigned to work among my beloved Indians, and note, I love too the Indians of M'Desi and of M. Petit, that Benjamin Petit. He had a deep love for the local Potawatomi and wanted to be missioned among them. Let me then hasten to my dear Indians. Now we know that Father Sorin didn't get his wish. We don't know whether Father Moreau just ignored him or said no. What we do know is that Father Sorin stayed here at the University of Notre Dame and did not minister among his beloved Indians. But I think it's a really important aspect of Notre Dame's story, particularly as we are grappling with acknowledging that we teach and learn on the traditional homelands of the Potawatomi. Another way to look at the founder's letter is what's left out. So what you see in yellow is what was on the previous slide, what's excerpted. And then there's an ellipse. And so when you go to the original letter, the part in white does not appear on the founder's plaque. So I'm going to talk about that for a minute. At this moment of his great founding vision, Father Sorin envisions that the brothers too, or he mentions the brothers, and he also hopes that the sisters, whose presence is so much desired here, that they must also be prepared, not merely for domestic work, but also for teaching, and perhaps too for the establishment of an academy. So he's hoping that sisters will come, and in fact, 4 sisters of the Holy Cross arrived in 1843, as Father Sorin had hoped, and as he had also wished, at least at the outset, that they not simply do domestic work, but they establish their own educational missions, which they did initially in Bertrand, Michigan, and then eventually across the street, what is now across the street. But nevertheless, they're not mentioned on the founder's plaque, and I think it's a really interesting story. And when we talk about who's remembered and why, and when we talk about who we celebrate in our history, we also ask who gets left out and in what ways and why. I'm writing an article for Notre Dame magazine that, if I finish it in time, will appear in the winter issue about some of these sisters. There were hundreds of them that were not at St. Mary's, but were on the campus at the University of Notre Dame. Like Mother Mary Ascension Salou, who, when she died in 1901, at her funeral, Father Daniel Hudson described her as next to Father Sorin, the person who had played the most significant role in building Notre Dame. We have no mechanism for remembering Mother Ascension, Mother Mary Ascension. Mother Angela Gillespie, of course, is memorialized in Angela Boulevard. She was just a wonderful, so Mother Mary Ascension was a native of France. She arrived here in 1846, as did many sisters come directly from France, and many came from Ireland. Eliza Gillespie, though, was from Ohio, and in fact, her brother, Neil Gillespie, was one of the first graduates of the University of Notre Dame and entered the Congregation of Holy Cross. Eliza Gillespie was a remarkable woman, and so remarkable, in fact, that one priest told her mother at one point, Eliza should never marry. I have yet to meet a man who could be her mental superior. So leaving aside the assumptions about marriage in that statement, it does signal that she was a remarkable woman. She had a religious vocation, and she and her mother were on their way to Chicago, where she was going to enter the Sisters of Mercy in 1853. And they stopped to see the brother and son, who at that point entered the Congregation of Holy Cross. Father Sorin met them at the entrance of Notre Dame, and in about 3 minutes, he had sized Eliza up and said, "You're not going to the Sisters of Mercy. You are who I've been waiting for. Please stay here and become a Sister of the Holy Cross." Father Sorin knew talent when he saw it. These women, we know comparatively a lot about them because they were superiors, But what we don't know is about the hundreds of women that worked here between 1843 and 1958. This is a not very good image, but one of the best we have of the convent that was located directly behind the Golden Dome, that housed the sisters. The sisters, as I said, did not leave until 1958, and I just want to talk a little bit about the ceremony in which they were bid farewell. The zealous and freely given service of the sisters made Notre Dame economically possible, and how true that is. The more research I do, I realize that it's the unrecognized and, of course, unpaid labor of these women, and men too, many of the brothers and many of the priests who remain nameless. This middle paragraph excerpt is fascinating. It says outright that Father Sorin intimated that the nuns were shirking their first duty. Though he had said in that founding vision, I don't just want them to do domestic work, I want them to do educational work. As Notre Dame grew and the Sisters of Holy Cross couldn't provide all the labor to sustain the domestic work, Father Sorin had to hire people, and he didn't like that. So he wanted the sisters to stop their educational mission and just provide domestic service. It became a very big conflict that was eventually resolved. But then this line that I've highlighted, the coming generation will forget the debt, how true that is. And this was 1958, and very soon after that, and certainly today, it is forgotten. So again, a more complicated founding story. Who do we remember and why? Sisters did not just work, of course, in domestic labor. They taught the minims. We have a member of the audience whose grandfather was a minim. Many of the men who were leaders of Notre Dame started out as minims in basically a grade school that was housed in St. Edward's Hall. Sisters worked in the print shop. In 1865, Father Sorin founded the Ave Maria, which was a journal to promote devotion to Our Lady. So let's talk now about not just women, but according to National Geographic in 2015, the world's most powerful woman. This is the title of the article that I've linked here, Mary. This is a wonderful map of Marian apparitions. Now there are, of course we know Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Fatima, but there are hundreds of reported Marian apparitions, only a very few that have received official Vatican recognition, which is designated by the red dot there. And this is just an enlarged image of Europe and basically France, where you can see so many Marian apparitions were reported and where so many of the approved ones are. I want to hone in, as I alluded, onto Our Lady of Lourdes, 1858 to a young peasant, Bernadette, who became Saint Bernadette. And this is the image, one of the largest images in the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, and truly beautiful. And again, 20 years before the grotto was built. The grotto that we know today was built after Father Sorin's death. It was built by Father Corby. But let's talk about Father Sorin and the Blessed Mother. So part of why some devotions had traction, if you will, why they became popular, had to do with missionaries who brought them places. And Father Sorin really tried to make Notre Dame the epicenter of devotion to Our Lady of Lourdes in the United States. So he was very enterprising. Notre Dame became the place where Americans could obtain holy water from Lourdes for a donation. You couldn't sell it canonically, but you could make a donation. Through his journal, he promoted it. And when it came time to build a second main building in 1865, there was a small dome with a statue of Mary atop it, painted white. This is Notre Dame's second main building that burned in April of 1879. As I tell my students, 1879 was the first time the spring semester got interrupted and everybody got sent home. It was because of a fire. I want to give you just a little bit of idea of what Sorin and other leaders at Notre Dame were trying to deal with. So after the fire, Father Sorin vowed to build even bigger. And this was a letter that was published in the Chicago Tribune, and not atypical. So this is criticizing the campaign to raise more money to rebuild the main building and to kind of build Notre Dame back. As a university, no one knows it. It claims as a school for teaching ultramontane doctrines. What that means is doctrines, ultramontane refers to Rome, to that connection to Rome. But the large image of the Virgin Mary, so conspicuous and so useless, are they going to replace that? This guy is criticizing how many of our distinguished medical men, how many mechanics, how many engineers, how many useful members of society has it turned out? Now, when criticized like this, and this is not, as I said, not unique, one reaction would be, well, okay, let's downplay our connections to Rome. Maybe not put a statue of Mary on top of the new main building. Father Soren was having none of that. So in the new main building, as we know, he commissioned a statue that was modeled on a statue that came from Rome, the statue of the Immaculate Conception. You can notice in the background, you can't see it very well, but the background, the building in the background there is Propaganda Fide. That is the Vatican Dicastery that is in charge of all the mission territories in the church, including the United States until 1908. Every time Father Soren went to Rome, he'd go to Propaganda Fide. So this was an image that he saw repeatedly, and that's what he wanted for his statue, Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. Here's an image that shows just how closely they resemble each other. Finances were really tight in the 1870s and 1880s, and Father Soren's council said that it could be a golden dome, but it would have to be painted in yellow or gold paint. Father Soren did not like to not get his way. He was determined that it be gilded in real gold. So he simply packed his bags and moved over to St. Mary's and the council couldn't meet without him, so until they relented and gave him his, assented to be able to have it in real gold. Another aspect of the 1880s, the Litari Medal was devised in 1883 as a way to honor American Catholics who had been useful members of society. See, so Catholics have turned out these people. We're going to announce this, and we still do this. It was modeled on a papal honor, though, called the Golden Rose. So that connection between Rome and America, it's not downplaying the connection, it's celebrating that connection, putting an American twist on it. This is another image painted by Luigi Gregori, actually regarded as one of his best images, but it depicts an imaginary scene. Pope Pius IX visiting the Church of the Sacred Heart before it was a basilica. So it actually never happened, but Father Soren took this image with him to Rome in 1876 and showed it to Pope Pius, and apparently he really liked it, but it's in our archives today, not on display. So again, having the Pope had never come to Notre Dame, but it was tied to Rome in so many ways. Now here we come to the Columbus Murals. This is just one of the high-resolution images that the university has made available now that the actual images are covered up most of the time. They were uncovered last week for teaching purposes, and a number of us utilize them in classrooms. In this one, The Death of Columbus, Father Soren was the model for Columbus. Again, these murals are about inserting Catholics into the American story. As polarizing as discussions are, I think when we understand them in the larger context of what was happening in the 1880s, I think they make more sense. So they're conversations I personally don't shy away from. I think they're really important to have. And I think the university as a whole has really made a wonderful commitment. The president's office, Father Jenkins, announced that as part of grappling with the Columbus murals and their negative portrayals of indigenous people, what Notre Dame was going to do is celebrate once again Founders Day, which used to be celebrated, the Feast of St. Edward's, on October 13th, and really grapple with its history, which I love. I think we should all be doing that more. I'm just beyond excited that this year, Founders Day is focusing on Father John Zahm. In part because, mainly because it is the centenary of his death. He died in 1921. Now, Chris Temple is here in the audience, and he knows more about John Zahm than I do, so I'm gonna, if I say anything wrong, Chris, please enlighten me. But we're planning a series of panels around Founders Day, which talk about Zahm as a scientist. This is his most famous publication. It's a reprint. But in 1896, he published Evolution and Dogma. So the theory of evolution was being promulgated. Did that conflict with church teaching? Zahm said no. And in fact, he didn't think we had to reconcile faith and science. He talked about faith and science as being mutually ennobling. They ennoble each other. Knowing science ennobles your faith and vice versa. Now, his book was a bit controversial and was actually ordered out of circulation under threat of being put on the index of forbidden books. So it didn't work out so well for him, but he's a remarkable figure. He also, I think another remarkable book, in 1913, he published Woman in Science, in which he talked about how women's long struggle for equality in the things of the mind, that the Catholic Church, the history of the Catholic Church showed that women have had the capacity to be scientists. Now, I love that he published this one under a pseudonym. It's an anagram of his name, H.J. Mosans. So Evolution, he publishes under his real name, but this one was under a pseudonym. I'm just so excited that our main Founders Day lecture is going to be given by Sister Damian Marie Savino, who is a Franciscan sister of the Eucharist. And look at her title, The Mutual Ennobling of Science and Faith, from Reverend John A. Zahm, CSC, to Laudate Si. This is Pope Francis's argument in Laudate Si, that it's not, faith and science are not in competition, they are, they ennoble each other. So I just can't wait for that. So hopefully that's something that, that you'll be able, another lecture you might be interested in. I could talk about Zahm all day, probably not as long as Chris Temple could, but there's just so many. It's interesting, he was never president of the University of Notre Dame, and in fact he tangled with presidents of the University of Notre Dame because he really had a vision for Notre Dame as a research university. And presidents like Andrew Morrissey believed that Notre Dame should continue to be kind of more than a French boarding school, but built on that model, that it would have a school, an industrial school, that it would have the minims, that it would have a preparatory school, basically a high school, that would have all those things, and that's what American Catholics needed demographically. Father Zahm said no. He said we need to be a university. And so he was instrumental in building the Science Center in 1884, which we know today as La Fortune. Here's a picture of a lab from the Science Center. I love this. Just across from the Science Center is Sorin Hall. So not the first residence hall in Notre Dame, because the Minims lived in St. Edward's Hall, but students at Notre Dame would have lived in the main building in what were essentially dormitories, like rows of beds and things. And Zahm argued that if you were truly going to be a university, the students would need a place where they could study, not in a group setting, but in their own room. So Sorin Hall was built. Actually, it's very funny. It was built, the rooms were supposed to be designed to be large enough to accommodate a desk, but small enough to discourage visitors. Now, I don't know if you've been around Sorin Hall on a Friday night, but the being small enough to discourage visitors is just not going to work, although I understand it's being renovated now. But it was part of this larger vision for being a university. The Lemonye Library, this is another, you'll recognize it now as Bond Hall, but until 1964 it was known as the Lemonye Library. That's named after a nephew of Father Sorin's who served as president of the university just very briefly between 1872 and 1874. But someone, again, who we don't talk about, but his fingerprints are all over this. So so that's what I mean when I say the 1880s and 1890s were such an important time to define Notre Dame as an American institution and as a college. Another person who we don't talk about a lot around here is another short-term president, Father James Burns. There's an award in the graduate school named after him, but not much else. He was president just for a brief time, but shared John Zahm's vision that Notre Dame should be a true American college. So he closed the preparatory school, that high school. Because this is sponsored by the dean's office, I'll just say that part of being a university is having deans, how important deans are. So if you want to communicate this back to your colleagues, Michael, in the dean's office, that I said this on record saying this. But seriously, a differentiation. The faculty would report to deans. The colleges would be differentiated. 4 colleges established in 1920, and a year later adding the College of Commerce. today Mendoza College of Business, but that was added a year later. Of course, it was Burns who said we need an endowment and raised what was then an incredible amount, a $1 million endowment, and not unrelated, established an advisory board of lay trustees. Not a lay board of trustees, that would come much later in the Hesburgh era, but an advisory board, and it was definitely tied to fundraising. Father Burns contributed to Notre Dame beyond his presidency, but figured he could really help more with fundraising, the aspect of that, so he was president for a very short time. I'm going to move now to my favorite president of the University of Notre Dame, and Father John knows this and knows why. But I want to talk about John Cardinal O'Hara, CSC, who was university president from 1934 to 1939. But his story, he entered the Notre Dame story much earlier than that. He was he was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, grew up in Peru, Indiana, came to the University of Notre Dame and entered the congregation, was ordained in 1916 as a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross. He served as prefect of religion in the 1920s. He also was the founding dean of the College of Commerce. So if you walk through Mendoza, there's a wonderful quote from him along the wall of the editorium there. He liked football. Again, it's not that football is unimportant to the story. This is the 1920s after all. But he talked about football as a new crusade that kills prejudice and stimulates faith. He said that the best thing about Notre Dame football is that it brought the country closer to God and to his Blessed Mother. So again, God, Notre Dame, country. For Father O'Hara, even in the 1920s and throughout the 1930s, it was about Notre Dame first, before country. This was a time when theologically it was just becoming okay to receive communion frequently. Usually you wouldn't receive communion, certainly not daily and not even weekly, but Pope Pius X advocated frequent communion, and Father O'Hara was all about that as prefect of religion at Notre Dame. In fact, he made national news when he arranged for Notre Dame football players to receive communion on their way to an away game. And actually the tradition of Notre Dame players going to Mass and receiving communion is credited to Father O'Hara. He became the university president in 1934, and he's not a president that we talk a lot about, but I think a lot of the modernization of Notre Dame in the 1930s was under his watch. Again, he still has the perspective, though. I think, Father Hesburgh naming his autobiography, God, Country, Notre Dame, makes sense, but if Father O'Hara had written an autobiography, it would have been God, Notre Dame, and Country. Father Ted very famously invited in 1960 President Eisenhower to receive an honorary degree at commencement, and also welcomed Cardinal Montini, the Vatican Secretary of State, who later became Pope Paul VI. But it was actually Cardinal O'Hara who became the first university president to host a sitting U.S. president and a future pope. In 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt visited the University of Notre Dame and received an honorary degree. So it was not at the commencement services. It had more to do with Roosevelt's trip to Chicago and coordinating about that. And here's Father O'Hara bestowing that honorary degree on him. This is a quote. Roosevelt is celebrating Notre Dame as an American institution. He would later send O'Hara as a delegate. O'Hara had lived in Latin America. He would send him as a delegate, as an American delegate, to conferences in Latin America. This event, which is commemorated, by the way, you may have seen, there's a plaque right outside La Fortune where the old field house used to be, where Stonehenge is now, that commemorates Franklin Delano Roosevelt's visit here in 1935. The building no longer stands, but it's commemorated. An embarrassing moment was averted. Apparently, Roosevelt's speechwriter thought that Notre Dame was a Jesuit institution. So the original speech was all about the Jesuits and how much they had contributed to America. Luckily, a member of Father O'Hara's staff caught it just in time, and Franklin Roosevelt corrected himself, although you'll notice he mentions a few Jesuits in the litany there. A year later, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli was visiting the United States. He became the highest Vatican official yet to visit, at that point, to visit the United States. And his visit was a big deal. And Father O'Hara wanted him to come to Notre Dame, especially after word got out that he was going to Georgetown. He's like, you've got to get here to Notre Dame. So it was actually Cardinal Spellman who helped arrange the visit here. And Father O'Hara remembered it as one of the most splendid days of his life. Cardinal Pacelli, of course, knew his religious congregations. It was under no illusion who the founders of the University of Notre Dame were. And there was a mass in the Basilica, and then in Washington Hall, a celebration that was really marvelous. This is an image of that. Cardinal Pacelli gave all Notre Dame students the next day off, so he was beloved by students. And it was something that really meant a lot to Father O'Hara, someone who could host a person who really was widely expected to become the next pope, and sure enough, within 3 years of this visit, became Pope Pius XII. Very soon after he was elevated to the papacy, guess who Pacelli appointed as a bishop? Father O'Hara from Notre Dame. And in 1939, O'Hara became the auxiliary archbishop to the Archdiocese of Military Services, which was created in 1939 as a way to coordinate the war effort, something we didn't have, the Catholic Church didn't have in World War I. So it would also be Pacelli who would elevate then Archbishop O'Hara to Cardinal O'Hara in 1958. So I love looking at this picture because I think about what was ahead for these two men, for both of them. Now, here's the reason he's my favorite president of the University of Notre Dame. After he was bishop in the military services, he was appointed Bishop of Buffalo, and then he was appointed Archbishop of Philadelphia. And I grew up in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and attended Cardinal O'Hara High School. And so I didn't know anything about him. I know there are a number of people from Philadelphia here, and you can testify that in Philadelphia, as far as we're concerned, Father O'Hara was born the day he arrived in Philadelphia. We had no previous knowledge of what he was. And it was only after I arrived here that I literally stumbled across his body in the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. Cardinal O'Hara, they wanted to keep him in Philadelphia in the cathedral, but he wanted to be with his confreres, buried with his confreres. He didn't actually get there. He got close, but because he's a cardinal, according to canon law, cardinals cannot be buried underground. So he is not actually with his confreres in Holy Cross Cemetery. He's in the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. I'm pictured here with a student of mine named Nicole McAlee, who graduated from Notre Dame in 2016 and took my class the semester her senior year. She had actually been ordered by Sister Lucy, who was our high school history teacher, that she was not allowed to graduate from Notre Dame until she took a class with Professor Cummings. So, so I met her then, and this is a tour we were doing of the Basilica. Nicole has been working at Notre Dame since last year, and I'm just so proud of her, and so happy that we share this connection to the two institutions that have shaped us. Actually, Nicole's parents are here today, so I'm just very excited to see them. Now, I'm going to end with a very jarring move into modernity. Okay, we've been talking about the first century of Notre Dame, and just a warning here. So Cardinal, he's buried here. I told you there's the quote in Mendoza, but he's not someone we remember a lot about. He's not someone we honor in any particular way, but I'm kind of glad about that because in the late 1960s and 70s, there was an effort to erect a building named after Cardinal O'Hara. And I'm going to show you the plans for that building. The John Cardinal O'Hara Chapel. Look at this monstrosity. So you can see Grace and Flanner Hall there, but originally the plan was to have lots more of Grace and Flanner Hall, and smack in the middle, the John Cardinal O'Hara Chapel, which looks like Space Mountain, which was kind of intended to modernize the Catholic Church at Notre Dame. Ooh, we are really glad that one didn't work out, aren't we? So I hope you'll all go to the Basilica, say a prayer in front of Cardinal O'Hara, and appreciate the beauty of the old church and not what we almost had. Thank you all very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to just give a few glimpses, and I'd be happy if we have time to take questions or to talk to anybody further. Thank you. Looks like we do have some time for questions. Yes?
I just want to know, the university was founded to be a national university. Did the student body reflect that in terms of where they came from?
They absolutely did. So one of the things I have my students do is read the first issue of the Scholastic, which was not published till 1865, so it's that's still 25 years after the founding, but that's one of the things they pick up right away. It has a list of all the students and where they come from, and it's national at that point. One of the hilarious things is that there's a notice in the Scholastic that if parents are concerned about whether their child arrived or not, there's a person they can write to. It's so different from today, right? When we all, it's just like, did my child arrive? I sent him off from Maryland, and please let me know if he arrived or tarried along the way. But no, absolutely, that's one of the things that the students notice right away. And that goes back to that quote that I opened with. It's a religious faith that defined the community, not geography. One of my students in Notre Dame America last semester, he said, I just love this. He said, I live right near Rutgers. And I love Rutgers, but like you never have a class called Rutgers in America. Now maybe there is, maybe I just don't know, but there's a class called Rutgers in America. But his point was that there are very few universities that you could teach a course like that. It's not just the history of the institution, it's the history of the interaction with America. And most of them, like if you taught a course called Harvard in America, maybe they do, it would be focused more on the elites and the way the university and everything is not. Yeah.
Thanks for a terrific lecture. I was wondering about, especially like the earliest part of the history of Notre Dame in the 19th century. Was there a time when it was mainly French that was spoken?
That's a great question. Certainly the Potawatomi and the brothers were French, and they spoke French, but almost immediately when they arrived in St. Peter's, so when they established in Vincennes, they received novices. He even nods to that in that excerpt that I showed. He hoped the sisters will get novices as read at St. Peter's. And many of them were Irish. He actually didn't like the Irish very much. He said some kind of disparaging things about the Irish. He liked the Germans better, German Americans. He thought they were more efficient. And the vocations came immediately from, French, so when he would write to Moreau, he would write in French, the superior language in French, but English was spoken very soon, and the official correspondence would be in French. It's very interesting in tracking these sisters, and it's very difficult, there's very little information. So many of them were born in Ireland, and they were a direct result of recruiting trips. They didn't call them that, but and the Congregation of Holy Cross was not alone in this, but actually going to Ireland and inducing young men and women to enter religious communities to come here to serve as missionaries. So again, they're different from immigrants. They're coming here to serve, to either enter or they entered before they left and came here. And the ones from Ireland are just remarkable. One historian who used to teach, my colleague Sloan Hill, who used to teach here, refers to the greening of French congregations in the 19th century because they so rapidly became populated with Irish or Irish American people. Yes?
Being an Irish sister.
Yay! Which congregation?
Mercy.
Oh, sorry about Mother Angela. You guys did okay. You're doing okay. Yeah.
I just wonder, would you care to comment on the controversy around the logo of the Fighting Irish?
Hey, listen, I talk about the Columbus Murals, I talk about the logo, nothing, I'll comment on anything. And actually being a historian is really helpful because again, this is something we talk about in Notre Dame America and the classes I teach that focus on Irish American history, because I think a lot of people don't know about the troubling history of the image of the leprechaun, which was based on disparaging images of the Irish in the 19th century. Images of the Irish as less than human and very simian-like features. The Fighting Irish, the term came into parlance in the 1920s, was adopted as the official motto, I think in 1928, maybe Brendan can tell me that. The image of the leprechaun was not adopted as the mascot of Notre Dame until much later, until the early 1970s. It had been an Irish Terrier, a little dog, who was really cute, but of course kept dying, so you had to replace that. So I think it's just important that people understand the history. I have a wonderful quote from a Holy Cross priest in the 1950s who says, "We took the term Fighting Irish, a disparaging term, and we made it our own, and it's a source of pride." And I think that is one argument to be made, but there's also a way in which that's not a credible argument today, that it's something that when you acknowledge the racist roots of it. So I guess my comment is we all should just know its origins and where it came from, and then from that basis make decisions. That's why I love the commitment of the University to Founders Day, and I hope it leads to a fuller understanding of the 19th century history of not just this university, but the history of Catholics in America. So, how's that for a comment? That's a long comment. So, you had a question?
I was just going to comment that down in the crypt, the Stations of the Cross have the designations in French.
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. I love to take my students on a tour of the Basilica, and it's usually after they've just read something about how American Notre Dame was, and this is from France, and this came from France, and the windows were all designed in France. Yes, certainly in terms of French and devotional life, it's very French. And Father Sorin, again, not triangle. He loved going to Rome, but he loved his beloved France. And when it came time to build the second church of the Sacred Heart, he wanted those stained glass windows commissioned. He commissioned the Carmelite sisters in Lemonye to design them. So yes, the French language is an important point. Yes?
The letter that Father Sorin wrote back to France to Father Moreau, I presume it was in French.
It was.
So we have this translation in bronze by the Law Chapel, and the phrase I'm curious about is, I've seen it many times, a powerful force for good, and everything, but also I see a powerful force for good. Is the word powerful in French somehow in the original French, do you think?
That's a great question, and it's one I don't know the answer to. I haven't seen the original French. The translation I use is from my former colleague, Father Marvin O'Connell, who was not a Holy Cross priest. He was a diocesan priest from Minnesota who taught for many years in the history department. He's actually buried, he's one of the few non-Holy Cross priests buried in Holy Cross Cemetery. So it's his translation in his biography of Father Sorin. So that would be a great question to ask a French scholar. I mean, I've asked about this letter to see the original. I think it's, well, I don't know. I think it's not widely circulated, but you know, a member of the congregation, there are several members of the Congregation of Holy Cross who have studied the original French, and that would be great for staff. But I myself don't know.
Did Father Sorin have a thick French accent as he aged? Did he develop more? I mean, you can tell he was from France, I suppose, and he spoke English.
Yeah. I presume so. I mean, we don't know. It's a lot of the missionaries I study. Missionaries to the United States never learned English. Like I think of Michael mentioned my most recent book was on American saints, and Francis Cabrini became the first American citizen to be a saint. Never mastered English. She just could never speak it. Yet you wouldn't know that from her. Father Sorin did learn it, and the other thing he used to say, and I learned this from Father Tom Glance's recent history of Notre Dame, which you should all, the masterful history that you should all read. But he says, I give thanks that I was not born under a French saint's name. He was born on the feast of St. Edward, right? So he was conscious that he didn't want to be too French, that would not fit in with his Americanizing ideals. But so he was at least conscious of that. So, but I don't know when he lost his accent. But another great question.
Frederick is his middle name. Frederick is his middle name.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I know now it is time for football. We did ahead of the game. Let's get to the